Hey guys, this is Fiddler Strain. Today I'm working on another image in my boot project of Crevo boots. This time I'm doing a top-down image, and I wanted to take you through the whole process step by step. So stick with me. First off, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I suspend my camera above my set when I'm doing a top-down. I use two light stands with super clamps, and in between the two super clamps, I'm using a piece of 1-inch steel tubing that I got at Home Depot for around 25 bucks. In the middle, I've got my camera on another super clamp and a ball head. With the three things, I'm able to move the camera forwards and backwards on the steel tubing, and I'm able to move the camera up and down on the light stands pretty easily. I used to use a circular tube that was more meant for photography before I started using the square tubing, but night and day difference between the square tubing and the circular tubing. The square tubing is so much more rigid and solid and really has a lot less error. I used to have a lot of problems where the camera would start rotating down and away from my scene as it would sort of fall. That never happens anymore, so it's a lot more rock solid, and for 25 bucks, you really can't beat it. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the lighting setup that I'm using in this particular shot, but in general, the lighting setup that I've been using for all the shots in this series. I've been trying to keep it fairly simple, so I've been using 2, maybe 3 lights in a few cases in this whole series of shots that I've been doing. Like I did in the very last shot and several other shots, I'm using a beauty dish, and I'm using a beauty dish with a grid on it and a sock to kind of soften things. The reason I'm using both those things is that with the grid, I'm trying to create a bit of a directionality with the lighting. I want the light to fall off really quickly on the edges of the frame and really just light the shoe and around the shoe area. I can do a little bit of post and dodge and burn on the ends, but I want to try to control the lighting as much as possible in frame. The other thing is I want the light to be very soft hitting the shoes because they're very shiny, and I want there to be a nice, smooth highlight on it. So that's why I've got a sock as well as the grid on the beauty dish. Besides the beauty dish, I'm also using one light to act as a fill. Since it's a top down, I'm able to just bounce it off of my white ceilings and let it shower the scene with a little bit of light to add into the shadows. In this case, I've got the fill light directly opposite and I'm just behind the camera so that it creates a very even light without creating a secondary shadow in any way, shape, or form. Lastly, I wanted to talk about composition. In this particular situation, the composition, I think, makes or breaks this image. The lighting really kind of follows behind the composition, and in this situation, I've got the lighting from the top left of the scene, which just sort of made sense considering where everything was laid out. I spent a vast majority of the time on this image just dealing with where I was going to put the shoes themselves and all the little props. I also spent an enormous amount of time just trying to figure out what type of props I was going to use. So the easiest way for me to describe this is to try to spend some time thinking about an overall theme or story behind the composition that you want to make. So I've got boots, and one thing I thought about doing was sort of have a boot with sort of a travel scene, with the idea of traveling. So with that in mind, I had to think of all the products and things I needed to purchase in order to pull off this idea of traveling with these boots. The first thing I found was this compass right here. The compass was shiny and brass, and although it looked really cool, it was a little bit too nice. So I had to look up and figure out how to make a distressed looking brass compass. It's actually pretty easy. You just stick it in a bowl with some vinegar and try not to let the vinegar touch it. You just let it steam around it, and eventually that vinegar will kind of tarnish the outside of the brass. It wasn't too hard. Next, I needed to find a whole bunch of other things that would make sense in this scene. I had a book called Atlas Obscura that I really liked the hardcover portion of it. I have an old camera that used to be my dad's. I thought that made sense in the scene. I have an old pocket watch, which most people don't think of pocket watches when they travel, but if you're a nerd like me, you read the book Latitude, and it makes total sense. So I've got some other things that are a little bit miscellaneous. I've got a pocket knife. I've also got some beads over here that are actually specific because they're an old school way of keeping track of distance. It's basically an abacus on a string so that you can count how many steps you've had. So each of these things, including the journal on the other side, which makes sense in most scenarios when you're talking about traveling, each of these things kind of fell in line. What I like to do normally is have a whole bunch of items and be able to choose different types of compasses, different types of pocket watches. But in this particular situation, I just had the one that I had. There's a few things that didn't really make the cut, like I have a magnifying glass right here, but I just didn't feel like it made sense in the scene, and it seemed a little bit too old school even for this thing. I've got a wristwatch, which I've used in another boot project photograph already, so I was trying to avoid using that if I could. I've also got a crazy Damascus steel knife, which I thought might make sense, but at the same time, it's a little bit overkill considering the scene that I'm doing. It's massive and kind of ridiculous considering this whole scenario. So once I've got all the props themselves, I have to go through the task of figuring out where to put it. I don't really have as much of a system most of the time. Sometimes I just sort of lay things out and see if it feels right there. But sometimes I like to follow shapes. The biggest thing I like to do is sort of follow a system of triangles when I really can't figure something out. That's a whole story in itself, which I probably won't get into. In this particular situation, I just sort of laid things where I thought it made sense. I put things in the corner that I thought were particularly big, like the map and the book. I tried to cut things off in the scene, except for the book, so it made more sense. I rolled the socks up and just put them into the shoes. Overall, everything sort of fell into place. But once it kind of got close, I spent a bunch of time just sort of twisting it this way and that way, just to kind of get it as perfect as I can. And to be honest, I haven't finished taking this photograph, so I'll end up spending more time taking little shots and deciding the watch is a 1/4 degree turn off, or the compass is just not quite facing the right direction, or the book is too far into the scene or too bright, so I need to put something in between the light source and the book. These are things that sort of evolve as you're working on the photograph, and it's something that I constantly do. The evolution of a photograph is the biggest thing. I've never had a photograph where I knew exactly what it was going to look like when I started the photograph, or at least that's been pretty rare. I take an idea and I put it in a scene, and I slowly build it and evolve it into what it is. So after I dialed in all the little props and everything around the image, after I dialed in the lighting to exactly the way I wanted it, here's what the final image looks like after all the retouching. As always, thanks so much for watching this video. Have a wonderful day.